Now we've seen a controller in action, and we see that the primary responsibility of a controller is to set up the model on our scope object. Angular passes scope to our controller function, and our controller manipulates that scope. Notice how our controller never has to directly manipulate the HTML, or what we call the view. It only manipulates scope by attaching a model. And then we use binding expressions to move data from the scope into the view. In future modules, we'll see how we can also set up methods to react to events. So when a user clicks a button or types into a text box, we'll be able to know about that from the controller, but we'll do that with directives. So again, the controller doesn't have to reach directly into the HTML to hook up events. And this setup creates a nice separation of concerns where the controller is focused on scope and the view is focused on HTML with some directives. And other than specifying which controller to use inside of my HTML, the view and the controller never interact directly. If you've ever worked with jQuery, you know that's a much different world because your JavaScript code typically directly manipulates the HTML. And it looks inside the HTML to find elements, to catch events, and you have to write code to move data between your JavaScript objects in the HTML. Angular simplifies these scenarios and you write a lot less code that is also better factored. It has a separation of concerns. And here's a few other things that we can do with controllers. First, on larger applications, you'll almost always have multiple controllers in your application, probably even on the same page, because each controller is going to be responsible for different features or different areas of data. So here's a page with 3 controllers, the date, quote, and chart controllers. You can also work against more complex objects. So instead of just having a simple message property on my scope object, I might attach a stock property to reference an object with symbol and price properties, and the binding expressions allow me to use dots to navigate inside of an object that is attached to scope, stock.symbol, stock.price. And then there's a couple interesting things about the chart controller. First, you'll notice it's nested inside of the quote controller. This is an advanced technique we probably won't use in this course, but I want to make you aware that it's possible. Also in this controller is something we will use, and that is we can use binding expressions not just to display text on the page, but we can also use them to set the attributes inside of our HTML. So in this example, we're setting the source and the description of an image. And I'm showing this example to let you know that you're not restricted to displaying just text on the screen. You can control anything you need just by setting up the right model data and then binding that data into the page at the right location. Let's try this out ourselves. Inside of our plunk, let's swing over to the main controller, and I want to now display information about a person. So just using the JavaScript object literal syntax, I'll define a person object, and let's give that person a first name of Scott and a last name of Alan. And I even want to give this object an image source that has a URL that points to a picture of me. A slightly dated picture, but that's okay. Now, just defining this person variable inside of the controller function does not make that object available for data binding. Right now, that variable is only available inside of this function, but I can take that variable, that person, and attach it to scope. And now my binding expressions in the view can reach into scope, into this person, and display the first name and last name. So let's try that. In index.html, I'll leave the message here. But let's create a div that will contain person information. So the first name of the person is person.firstname. And the last name of a person is person.lastname. And then let's try to display the image. So I need an image whose source is equal to person.imageSource. And instead of using an alt tag, which is good, I'm going to use a title tag to show you an expression that will appear if I mouse over that image. So inside of here, I want to put in person.firstname space person.lastname. And now once the page refreshes, if I mouse over, I can see that displays Scott Allen. So I'm using that model information not just to display text on the screen and intermingle binding expressions with literal text. I'm also using my model to set attributes of an image so that we can display a picture on the screen. Now, one quick tip about using a binding expression in the source of an image. You have to think a little bit about how a browser works. When this HTML renders, the browser is going to see image source equals and then this binding expression. It's not until later when Angular is up and running that it comes in and replaces person.imageSource with the value from my model. But unfortunately, the way the browser works, as soon as it sees image source equals double curly person.imageSource, it's going to go and try to download an image, treating that binding expression as a URL. And in fact, down inside of the console window here, you can see that each time it refreshed the preview window, it tried to grab that image and got a 404 error, could not be found. And this is why Angular provides a directive ng-source. You'll notice now the preview window refreshed, but I did not get a 404 error, and I still have my image. The purpose of the ng-source directive is that once Angular is up and running, once it has evaluated this expression, then it will come in and set the actual source attribute for that image, and the image should be successfully downloaded, and you'll avoid these 404 errors. So ng-source is just a directive to set the source of an image when there's a data binding expression involved. That's a quick little tip. And there are many more directives that we'll see, particularly in the next module. I also just want to point out one other thing about Angular. Let's say I have a typo here, and instead of person.firstname, I forgot the E. And a couple things to notice. First of all, the first name did not display in the preview window because I'm trying to reference a property that doesn't exist on person. And secondly, there was no new error created in the console window. This is the way Angular works, and it has some pros and cons. The pros are that a page doesn't break just because something isn't available. Now in this case, I have a typographical error. I meant to type first name, and I wish this would have been treated as an error so I could catch it without visually examining the page and seeing that that doesn't appear. However, the Angular philosophy is if a binding expression doesn't work, don't throw an error, just continue on, because you might be trying to bind to data that doesn't exist yet. It's data that we have to retrieve from a web server and massage before we make it available. And so it's okay to try to bind person.firstname. Maybe person doesn't exist yet, but it's not going to break the page. It'll fill in later when we get the data. But that does mean that you have to watch out on your page and make sure it's displaying the expected data. But what about this scenario I'm talking about? The scenario where I want to display person.firstname, but it's not available yet because I have to retrieve it from the server. Let's actually try to retrieve some data from a server and see how that works with our controller and the model and the data binding.